Thin smoke curled upward from a chimney that had no right to be breathing. The cabin sat half a mile past the tree line, tucked into a shallow fold of land where the pines grew close together and the ground never fully dried, even in August. I saw it from the ridge, a single thread of gray climbing straight into the still night air, so thin it could have been a trick of the moonlight, a smudge on the darkness that might vanish if I blinked. But I did not blink. I watched it for a long while, standing on that ridge with my hand resting on the stock of my carbine, and the smoke did not stop. It rose and rose, patient as a prayer, dissolving somewhere above the treetops where the stars began. And that's when I realized some things in this world don't need explaining. They just need witnessing. My name's Carter Hale. I used to be the deputy in Cottonwood Creek. Evening, friend. Come sit a while. The fire's about down to its last good coal, but it's got enough warmth left in it if you lean close. I've been sitting here most of the evening, watching the dark come in across the flats, and my mind's been turning over an old night. Not a bad night, not a dangerous one either. Just a night that stayed with me longer than most, the way certain nights do when the air is cold enough to sharpen every small thing into something you can still feel decades later. This would have been the winter of '83, maybe '84. The years run together after a while, and I've stopped trying to nail them down with any certainty. What I remember clearly is the cold. It had come in from the north 3 days prior, slow and deliberate, the kind of cold that doesn't arrive with wind or bluster, but simply settles over the land like a hand pressing down on a table. By the third evening, the ground was hard as fired clay, and the creek that ran behind the jailhouse had gone quiet along its edges, where the ice was creeping inward from the banks. Not frozen through? Cottonwood Creek never froze through, not even in the worst years, but narrowed, hushed, moving slower beneath a skin of crystal that caught the lantern light if you walked close enough to see it. I was on night patrol. Sheriff Dunn had gone home early that evening, which was unusual for him. He was a man who kept to his hours, the way a clock keeps to its gears, steady and reliable and never early, never late. But he had been nursing a cough for the better part of a week, a deep rattling thing that started in his chest and came up through his throat like gravel being shaken in a tin cup. And by that third night of cold, the cough had won. He stood up from his desk around 7 o'clock, put on his coat, and told me to walk the town twice before midnight and then lock up. I told him I would. He nodded once and left, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet office. I sat at the desk for a time after he left. The stove in the corner was putting out a low, even heat, and the lamp on the desk threw a circle of amber light across the papers and the inkwell and the edge of the open ledger where I had been recording the day's entries. There was not much to record. A complaint from the Hargrove family about a stray dog that had been coming around their hen house. A note about a broken spoke on the freight wagon that had come through from Silver Falls, the kind of entries that fill a ledger without filling a life. Small marks of ink that say a town was alive and nothing more. I closed the ledger and stood and put on my coat. It was a heavy wool thing, dark brown, with a collar that came up high enough to cover the back of my neck if I turned it up. I had bought it 2 winters prior from a peddler who came through town with a wagon full of coats and blankets and bolts of cloth, and it was the best purchase I ever made in those years. The wool held heat, the way good earth holds water, slow and deep and reluctant to let it go. I buttoned it to the top, pulled my hat down snug, and stepped outside. The cold met me at the door, not with violence, not with that sharp bite you get when a winter wind catches your face, but with a kind of vast, encompassing stillness that felt almost like being held. The air did not move. That was the first thing I noticed, and it stayed with me all through the night. There was no wind at all. None. The flag above the general store hung limp against its pole, and the wooden signs that usually creaked and swung along Main Street were motionless, each one frozen in its place, as though time itself had paused and forgotten to resume. I walked south along Main Street first. My boots sounded loud on the boardwalk planks, each step a flat, wooden report that echoed off the storefronts and came back to me a half-second later from the buildings across the way. I have always liked that sound. There is something reassuring about the rhythm of your own boots on good wood. It tells you where you are. It tells you the ground is solid. It tells you that you are moving through the world at a pace you can trust. The first stop was Hadley's Dry Goods. The door was latched, the windows dark. I pressed my hand flat against the door and felt the latch hold firm, and that was enough. I moved on to the barber shop beside it, where Walt Crichton kept his single chair and his row of razors lined up behind the mirror like soldiers standing at attention. The barber shop was dark, too. The latch held. Through the window, I could see the chair, a pale shape in the gloom, and the mirror behind it catching some faint reflection of the street, the boardwalk railing, the edge of a post, a smear of lamplight from somewhere farther down the block. I stood there for a moment, looking at that dark reflection, the way you sometimes look at a pond and see the sky upside down and feel, for just a breath, that the world has 2 sides and you are standing on the seam between them. I checked the feed store next, and then the land office, and then the little narrow building where Mrs. Calloway ran her seamstress shop. Each door was latched, each window was dark. The town was asleep, or getting there, and the only light still burning on the south end of Main Street was the lantern outside the saloon, which old Pete Garza left lit every night, whether the place was open or not. He said it kept the drunks from falling off the porch steps, which may have been true, though the drunks seemed to find the steps regardless. I turned at the end of the street and started back north. The cold had settled deeper now, or maybe I was just feeling it more. My breath came out in slow, thick clouds that hung in front of my face for a moment before dissolving. I watched each one form and fade, a rhythm as steady and unremarkable as breathing itself, which of course it was. The sky overhead was enormous. I have said that before, I know, but it bears repeating for anyone who has never stood in the open land of the territories on a windless winter night and looked up. The stars were not scattered. They were packed, dense, and bright, and layered so deep that the spaces between them seemed to glow with a faint powder of light, as though even the darkness was luminous. I stopped walking and looked up for a while. There was no reason not to. The town was quiet, the doors were latched, and the stars were doing what stars do, which is simply being there, asking nothing, offering nothing but their ancient, indifferent light. After a time, I lowered my eyes and continued north. I passed the church, which sat slightly off the main road on a small rise of ground that gave it a view of the whole street. The church was dark. Reverend Fenton had gone to bed hours ago. He was an early sleeper and an early riser, a man whose days were bookended by prayer and whose nights, I imagined, were filled with the kind of deep, untroubled sleep that comes from believing the world is in better. I turned at the end of the street and started back north. The cold had settled deeper now, or maybe I was just feeling it more. My breath came out in slow, thick clouds that hung in front of my face for a moment before dissolving. I watched each one form and fade, a rhythm as steady and unremarkable as breathing itself, which of course it was. The sky overhead was enormous. I have said that before, I know, but it bears repeating for anyone who has never stood in the open land of the territories on a windless winter night and looked up. The stars were not scattered. They were packed, dense and bright, and layered so deep that the spaces between them seemed to glow with a faint powder of light, as though even the darkness was luminous. I stopped walking and looked up for a while. There was no reason not to. The town was quiet. The doors were latched, and the stars were doing what stars do, which is simply being there, asking nothing, offering nothing but their ancient, indifferent light. After a time, I lowered my eyes and continued north. I passed the church, which sat slightly off the main road on a small rise of ground that gave it a view of the whole street. The church was dark. Reverend Fenton had gone to bed hours ago. He was an early sleeper and an early riser, a man whose days were bookended by prayer and whose nights, I imagined, were filled with the kind of deep, untroubled sleep that comes from believing the world is in better hands than your own. Past the church, the boardwalk ended and the road turned to packed dirt, and the town began to thin out into the scattered homesteads and small holdings that stretched north toward the ridge. This was the edge of my usual patrol. Most nights, I would turn here, walk back south, make my second pass, and call it done. But that night, I kept walking. I cannot tell you exactly why. There was no sound that drew me, no light that caught my eye, no instinct of trouble or urgency pulling me forward. It was simply that the night was so still, and the cold was so clean, and the walking felt so easy, that stopping seemed like the harder thing to do. So I walked on, past the last fence post of the Ridley property, past the old well that nobody used anymore, since the new one was dug closer to town, past the stand of cottonwoods that gave our town its name and that stood along the creek bank like a congregation of old men. their bare branches reaching upward into the dark. The ground rose gradually as I moved north. The road, such as it was, became a trail, and the trail became a suggestion. And eventually, I was walking on open ground with nothing but the frost-hardened grass beneath my boots and the faint silver line of the creek off to my left. The creek was louder here, away from town, where it tumbled over a series of low rock shelves before settling into the wider, slower stretch that passed behind the jailhouse. I could hear it talking to itself in that way that running water does, a sound that is never quite the same from one moment to the next, but never quite different either, like a conversation carried on in a language you almost understand. I walked for perhaps 20 minutes more before I reached the ridge. It was not much of a ridge, really, just a long, low rise of ground where the prairie buckled up before settling again into the shallow valley beyond. From the top of it, you could see north for a good distance, out across the dark land to where the tree line began, a ragged edge of pine and juniper that marked the start of the foothills. And it was from this ridge, on this night, that I saw the smoke. It was so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it. A single wisp of gray against the darker gray of the trees, rising from a point perhaps half a mile distant, where I knew, or thought I knew, there was a cabin. An old trapper's cabin, built years before I came to Cottonwood Creek, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. I had been out that way once or twice in daylight, on rides that took me beyond the usual boundaries of town business, and I recalled it as a small, squat structure of logs and mud chinking, with a roof that sagged in the middle and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side like a man favoring a bad leg. Nobody lived there. Nobody had lived there in years, but there was smoke coming from that chimney. Thin, pale, barely visible, but unmistakable once you saw it, rising straight up into the motionless air without the slightest waver or bend, as steady as if it had been drawn there with a pencil. I stood on the ridge and watched it, the cold pressed against my face and my hands, and the tops of my ears where my hat did not cover, and I felt no urgency to move. That is something I want to be clear about, because the telling of a thing can sometimes give it a shape it did not have in the living. I was not alarmed. I was not even particularly curious, not in the sharp, active way that curiosity usually works when something is wrong. It was more like the feeling you get when you notice a new crack in a wall you have walked past 1,000 times. A quiet awareness that something has changed, paired with a willingness to look at it without rushing to understand why. I began walking toward the cabin. The ground sloped down from the ridge into the shallow valley, and the grass here was longer and stiffer, frozen into pale, brittle stalks that crunched softly under my boots. The sound was small and rhythmic, a gentle percussion that accompanied each step, and I found myself matching my breathing to it without thinking. Step, crunch, breath, step, crunch, breath. The way you sometimes fall into a rhythm that your body chooses for you and your mind simply follows. The trees grew closer together as I descended, pines mostly, with a few junipers scattered among them, their dark shapes rising on either side of me like sentinels posted along a corridor. The air changed as I moved into the trees. It was still cold, still perfectly still, but there was a density to it now, a smell of pine resin and frozen earth and something else, something I could not name, that was not unpleasant, but was unfamiliar. It was the smell of a place that had been alone with itself for a long time. The cabin came into view gradually. First the chimney, that crooked finger of stone rising above the tree line, and then the roof line, and then the walls themselves, dark and solid against the darker ground. The smoke was clearer now, a thin column of pale gray rising from the chimney's mouth and climbing into the black sky above the pines. I stopped at the edge of the small clearing where the cabin sat and simply looked. The cabin was just as I remembered it from my daylight visits, small and low, and built with the rough practicality of a man who needed shelter and nothing more. The logs were old and weathered to a uniform gray, the chinking between them cracked and missing in places. The door was a single plank of heavy wood hung on iron hinges that were rusted the color of dried blood. The one window, there was only one, facing south, was dark. No light came from inside. No glow of a fire, no flicker of a candle, nothing. The window was a black square set into the gray wall, reflecting nothing. And yet the smoke rose, thin and pale and steady. It climbed from the chimney, without pause, without variation, as though it had been rising for hours and intended to go on rising for hours more. I watched it for a long time, minutes certainly, perhaps longer. Time moves differently when you are standing alone in the dark, watching something you cannot explain. It does not speed up or slow down so much as it simply loses its edges, becomes soft and indefinite, like a shape seen through fog. I listened. The silence was extraordinary. I have been in quiet places before. The desert at midday, the prairie at dawn, the inside of an empty church. But this was something beyond quiet. It was the absence of sound so complete that it felt like a presence in itself, a thing that occupied the space around me the way water fills a bowl. The trees did not move. The wind did not blow. Even the creek, which I knew was somewhere nearby, was inaudible from where I stood. The only sound was the faint, almost imagined whisper of the smoke rising, which was not really a sound at all, but something my mind invented to fill the void. I took a step toward the cabin, then another. The frozen grass crunched beneath my boots, and the sound seemed too loud, as though I were intruding on something that had not asked to be disturbed. I stopped again, perhaps 20 paces from the door, and stood there with my hands at my sides, looking at the cabin the way you look at a sleeping animal, carefully, respectfully, with no desire to wake it. The door was closed. The window was dark. The smoke rose. These three facts arranged themselves in my mind and stayed there, simple and clear and resistant to any further analysis. A cabin with smoke but no fire, or rather, no visible fire. No light, no warmth leaking from the window, no glow at the base of the chimney where a fire burning inside should have sent at least a faint orange suggestion through the gaps in the stone. There was only the smoke, pale and thin and patient, rising into the night as though it had always been there and always would be. I approached the door. I did not hurry. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, placing my boots carefully on the hard ground, as though the ground itself might object to being stepped on. When I reached the door, I stopped and stood before it. The wood was old and deeply grained, the surface rough beneath my fingertips when I raised my hand and touched it. It was cold. Cold the way stone is cold, the way iron is cold, with a deep, settled chill that spoke of long hours without warmth, days or weeks or longer. I pressed my palm flat against it and held it there. There was no vibration, no heat, no hum of life on the other side. Just wood, just cold. I leaned close and listened. My ear was perhaps an inch from the surface of the door, and I held my breath and listened with the full attention that only silence and solitude can produce. I heard nothing. Not the creak of a floorboard, not the settling of a log, not the pop of a coal, or the whisper of ash falling in a hearth. The silence on the other side of that door was as complete as the silence around me, as though the cabin's interior and the night outside were made of the same substance, the same vast, unbroken quiet. I lifted the latch. It moved easily, without resistance, the iron cool and smooth under my thumb. The door swung inward on its hinges, and the hinges did not squeal or groan as I expected them to. They moved silently, as though they had been oiled that very morning, and the door opened into a darkness so absolute that for a moment I could not tell where the cabin ended and the night began. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged from the dark. The stone hearth against the far wall, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a narrow cot in the corner, its mattress a flat, shapeless thing that might have been straw or might have been nothing at all. The floor was packed, earth smooth and hard, and the walls were bare logs, with the bark still on them, the chinking between them dried to a pale, powdery gray. The hearth drew my attention. I crossed the small room in 4 steps and knelt before it. The stones were cold to the touch, as cold as the air itself. I put my hand inside the firebox, feeling along the floor of it where ash should have been, where coals should have been if a fire had been burning recently enough to send smoke up the chimney. My fingers found nothing. No ash, no coals, no residue of any kind. The hearthstone was clean, smooth, bare as the day it was laid. I ran my palm across it twice to be sure, and both times my hand came away clean and cold and empty. I sat back on my heels and looked at the hearth. Then I stood and looked at the chimney from the inside, craning my neck to peer up into the dark shaft of stone. I could see, far above, a small circle of stars where the chimney opened to the sky. And between me and those stars, rising through the shaft with the same unhurried patience I had watched from outside, the smoke climbed. I could see it now, faintly, a thread of pale gray drifting upward through the darkness of the chimney, its source invisible, its origin nowhere I could identify. There was no fire. There was no ember, no coal, no smoldering wood, no tinder, no spark. The hearth was cold and clean and empty, and the smoke rose. I stayed in that cabin for a long time. I did not sit down. I did not light a match or a candle, though I had both in my coat pocket. I simply stood in the center of the room, in the dark, and listened to the silence and watched the faint suggestion of smoke climbing the chimney toward the stars. I felt no fear. I want to say that clearly, because a story like this invites fear in the telling, and I do not want to give it something it did not earn. What I felt was closer to stillness, as though the cabin's quiet had entered me through the soles of my boots and risen up through my body the way the smoke rose through the chimney, filling me with a calm I had not asked for and did not entirely understand. After a time, I cannot say how long, I turned and walked back to the door. I stepped outside into the clearing and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch fell into place with a soft click. I stood there for another moment, looking at the cabin, at the smoke still rising from the chimney, at the trees standing motionless around the clearing, at the stars overhead, thick and bright and unconcerned with anything happening below them. Then I walked back toward town. The walk back was slower than the walk out, though I cannot say whether that was because I was tired or because the night had deepened into that heavy, late-hour quality that makes everything feel thicker and more deliberate. The frozen grass crunched under my boots. The trees thinned and fell away behind me as I climbed the ridge, and the open prairie spread out before me again, silver and black under the stars. The creek reappeared to my left, its voice returning to me in soft, murmuring fragments as I came back within earshot, and I was glad to hear it. It was a familiar sound, a sound that belonged to the world I knew, and it felt like greeting an old friend after a long absence. I crossed the ridge and started down the long, gentle slope toward town. The rooftops of Cottonwood Creek were visible in the distance, low, dark shapes against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. And the single lantern outside Pete Cars's saloon was a small, warm point of yellow that seemed to pulse faintly as I watched, though that was probably just the distance playing tricks with my eyes. My patrol was unfinished. I had checked the south end of Main Street, but not the north, and I had not yet made my second pass, which Sheriff Dunn expected of me before midnight. The walk to the cabin and back had taken longer than I realized. I picked up my pace slightly, not rushing, but moving with a steadier purpose, and the boardwalk met me again at the north end of town, with its familiar flat sound under my boots. I checked the north doors, the hardware store, the assay office, the small, cramped building where Doc Fielding kept his practice, with its smell of carbolic acid and camphor that seeped through the doorframe even when the door was locked. Each latch held, each window was dark. The town was asleep, deeply and fully, and the only movement was the slow drift of my breath in the cold air and the faint stirring of a cat that crossed the street ahead of me, a gray shape moving with the silent, liquid grace that only cats possess, and then vanishing into the shadows beside the church as though it had never been there at all. I made my second pass, south along Main Street, checking each door again, not because I expected anything to have changed, but because the routine itself was the point. A patrol is not about finding trouble. A patrol is about the walking. It is about placing yourself in the spaces between the locked doors and the dark windows and the sleeping families, being present in the quiet so that the quiet can go on being quiet. Most people do not think about that. They think a deputy's job is catching criminals and breaking up fights, and there is some of that to be sure, but the greater part of it, the part that fills most of the hours, is simply being there, walking, watching, listening to the town breathe. I finished my second pass and returned to the jailhouse. The stove had burned down while I was gone, and the office was cool but not cold. Still holding some of the warmth that had gathered during the evening, I added a few pieces of split pine to the stove and opened the draft. And within a few minutes, the fire was catching again, sending its quiet crackling into the room and pushing the chill back toward the walls. I sat down at the desk and opened the ledger. The lamp was still burning, its flame steady and small, and I trimmed the wick before I began writing. The entry for that night was brief. I wrote the date, the time, the weather, clear, calm, very cold, and the results of my patrol. All doors secure, no disturbances. I hesitated for a moment, my pen hovering above the page, and then I added one more line. I wrote, "Observed smoke from chimney of old trapper's cabin north of ridge. No fire found inside. Cause unknown." I looked at those words for a while. They sat on the page in my careful square handwriting, and they were true, every one of them, but they did not capture the thing itself. They did not capture the silence, or the stillness, or the way the smoke had risen with such patience and steadiness into the dark. They did not capture the clean, cold hearth, or the empty room, or the feeling I had carried back with me across the ridge and into town. That sense of having witnessed something that existed at the very edge of understanding, something that was not threatening or malevolent, but simply other, simply beyond the reach of the words I had available to describe it. I closed the ledger and capped the inkwell. Then I sat back in the chair and listened to the stove tick and settle as the new wood caught and the heat began to build. The clock on the wall said it was 1:15 midnight. My shift was over. I could lock up and go home to my small room at the boarding house, where my bed would be cold at first, but would warm quickly once I was under the blankets, and where I would sleep soundly until the gray light of dawn came through the window and the roosters began their morning argument. But I did not go home right away. I sat in the chair in the quiet office with the lamp burning and the stove warming and the night pressing against the windows, and I thought about the cabin. I thought about the smoke. I thought about the things in this world that we encounter and cannot explain, and eventually learn to set aside, not because they stop mattering, but because carrying them forward serves no purpose beyond the carrying itself. I had been deputy in Cottonwood Creek for going on 4 years by that winter. In those 4 years, I had seen my share of small mysteries. Things that did not add up. Things that resisted the clean logic of cause and effect that a lawman is trained to apply. The tracks that stopped. I have mentioned those before, and I will not go into them again tonight, except to say that the cabin and its smoke reminded me of those tracks in a way I could not quite articulate. Not because the two events were connected. I do not believe they were, but because they shared a quality, a texture, a way of sitting in the mind that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but simply persistent. They were facts that resisted being filed away. They sat in the open, on the desk of my memory, and no matter how many times I tried to put them in a drawer, they were back on the desk by morning. I went back to the cabin the next day. I rode out after breakfast, when the sun was still low, and the frost on the grass had not yet melted, and the world had that clean, sharp-edged quality that only winter mornings possess. The horse moved easily beneath me, her breath coming in white plumes that trailed behind us like small flags. I followed the same route I had walked the night before, up over the ridge and down into the shallow valley where the pines grew thick. The cabin looked different in daylight. Smaller, more ordinary, just an old structure of weathered logs and crumbling chinking, with a roof that sagged and a chimney that leaned. The door was closed just as I had left it. The window was dark, which meant nothing in daylight. The clearing around the cabin was covered in a thin layer of frost that sparkled when the low sun caught it. And my footprints from the night before were visible in the stiff grass, a trail of dark marks leading from the tree line to the door and back again. There was no smoke. The chimney stood silent against the pale sky, its mouth open and empty. No thread of gray rising from it. No suggestion that anything had ever risen from it. I dismounted and tied the horse to a low branch and walked to the cabin and opened the door. Inside, everything was as I had found it the night before. The hearth was cold and clean. The table and chair stood in their places. The cot in the corner held its flat, shapeless mattress. The floor was packed earth, unmarked by any footprint other than the faint impressions of my own boots from the previous night. I knelt at the hearth again and ran my hand along the hearthstone. And again I found nothing. No ash, no soot, no residue. I looked up the chimney and saw only the circle of sky at its top, blue now instead of black, and no smoke at all. I stood in the cabin for a few minutes, listening. In daylight, the silence was less remarkable. I could hear the creek now, a gentle murmur from somewhere behind the cabin, and a bird was calling from the pines, a high, thin note that repeated at regular intervals, like a small bell being struck. The cabin was just a cabin, an old, empty, abandoned cabin. The kind you find scattered across the territories wherever men once lived and then moved on or died or simply ceased to be. I left the cabin and rode back to town. I did not record the visit in the ledger. There was nothing to record. I had gone out, I had looked, I had found nothing, The smoke was gone. The cabin was empty. The morning was cold and bright, and the town was waking up. And there were doors to check, and complaints to hear, and the ordinary business of a day to attend to. But that evening, just before sunset, I climbed to the second floor of the jailhouse, where there was a narrow window that faced north, and I looked out toward the ridge. The sky was turning colors, that slow procession from blue to gold to deep amber that happens in winter when the sun goes down early and the air is dry and clear. The ridge was a dark line against the fading light, and beyond it, just visible above the tree line, I could see the top of the chimney. There was no smoke. I watched for a long time, until the light was gone and the ridge was just a shape in the dark, and there was no smoke. I turned away from the window and went downstairs and lit the lamp and opened the ledger and began the evening's entries. I did not go back to the cabin that night. I walked my patrol, south and then north and then south again. And I checked the doors and I watched the stars and I listened to the town settle into sleep. And I did not think about the smoke more than 2 or 3 times, which for me was a kind of victory. The next night, I looked again from the upstairs window. Nothing. The night after that, nothing. On the 4th night, I did not look. I walked my patrol and wrote my entries and banked the stove and locked the office and went home to bed. And I slept well, the way a man sleeps when he has decided, without quite making the decision, that some things are better left where they are. A week passed. The cold held. Day after day, night after night, the air so still and dry that the frost on the ground never melted, not even at midday when the sun was highest. The town went about its business. Mrs. Hargrove's stray dog was caught and turned out to be a half-grown coyote pup that had wandered in from the scrubland, too young and too hungry to be afraid of hen houses. Walt Creighton broke a tooth on a piece of hardtack and spent 2 days in Doc Fielding's chair having it pulled, and the sound of his hollering could be heard clear across Main Street, which gave the town something to talk about. That was not the weather. Sheriff Dunn's cough improved. He was back at his desk by midweek, his color better, his voice still rough, but his eyes sharp and clear as ever. He read my ledger entries for the week without comment, turning the pages slowly, his finger moving down the lines of my handwriting. When he reached the entry about the smoke, he paused. He read it twice. Then he looked up at me. "What cabin is this?" he said. "The old trapper's place," I told him. "North of the ridge, past the tree line." He nodded slowly. He knew the cabin. Everybody who had been in Cottonwood Creek for any length of time knew the cabin, or knew of it in the vague way that people know about abandoned places on the edges of their world, aware of its existence, but uninterested in its particulars. "And you went inside," he said. I did, and there was no fire, no sir. Hearth was clean, cold as the ground. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him weighing something behind his eyes, turning it over the way you turn a coin between your fingers, examining both sides. Then he closed the ledger and set it on the desk and leaned back in his chair. "Old places do strange things," he said. "Wood settles. Stone holds heat from the day and lets it go at night. Could be condensation from the chimney, looking like smoke in the cold air. Could be, I said. He nodded again, and that was the end of it. We did not speak of it again. The entry stayed in the ledger, one line among hundreds, and the days went on, and the cold eventually broke, and spring came with its mud and its green and its restless wind, and the town turned its attention to planting and building and all the forward-looking business that warm weather brings. But I went back one more time. It was weeks later, on another night patrol, another still and cold evening when the air did not move and the stars were thick overhead. I had not planned to go. I was walking my usual route, south and then north, and when I reached the northern edge of town, where the boardwalk ends and the packed dirt begins, I kept walking, just as I had before, without deciding to, without thinking about it, just letting my feet carry me past the last fence post, past the old well, past the cottonwoods along the creek, and up the gentle slope to the ridge. I stood on the ridge and looked north. The tree line was a dark wall against the sky, and above it, thin and pale and steady as a held breath, the smoke rose. I watched it for a long while. I did not walk toward it this time. I stood on the ridge with my hands in my coat pockets and my collar turned up against the cold, and I watched the smoke climb into the still air, and I felt again that sense of calm I had felt inside the cabin, that deep, settled quiet that was not the absence of something, but the presence of something I had no name for. After a time, I turned and walked back to town. I finished my patrol. I wrote my entries in the ledger. I did not record the smoke. Some things I had begun to understand are not meant for ledgers. They are meant for the quiet space between waking and sleeping, for the long, still hours when the mind lets go of its need to sort and file and explain, and simply allows a thing to be what it is. I am an old man now, friends. I have been an old man for longer than I was ever young. Or so it feels on nights like this. One, when the fire is low and the dark is wide, and the air has that same deep stillness I remember from those winter patrols. I still live here in Cottonwood Creek. I have always lived here. This is my town, the place where I learned what it means to walk through the world with your eyes open and your mouth closed, paying attention to the things that matter and letting the rest drift past like smoke. I never did find out what caused the smoke in that cabin. I never found a fire, never found evidence of one, never found a person or an animal or any living thing that might have been responsible. I looked and I found nothing, and eventually I stopped looking, not because the questions stopped mattering, but because I came to understand that the answer, if there was one, was not mine to find. Some things in this country are older than the people who live in it, older than the towns, older than the roads, older than the names we give to places and the stories we tell about them. They were here before us, and they will be here after. And the best we can do, the only thing we can do, really, is notice them when they show themselves and carry the noticing with us, quietly, without fuss. The way you carry a smooth stone in your pocket that you found by a river and kept for no reason other than the weight of it felt right in your hand. That cabin is still out there, far as I know, past the ridge, past the tree line, sitting in its little clearing with its sagging roof and its crooked chimney. I have not been out to it in many years. My walking days are shorter now and the ridge seems farther than it used to be. But on certain nights, cold nights, when the air does not move and the sky is packed with stars, I sometimes stand on my own porch here at the edge of town and look north, past the rooftops, past the cottonwoods, past the dark line of the ridge, and I wonder. I do not wonder what caused the smoke. I have let that question go, set it down like a burden I carried long enough. What I wonder is simpler than that. I wonder if the smoke is still rising, if it is still climbing, thin and pale and patient, into the cold night air above the pines. I wonder if it has been rising all these years, all these decades, through every season and every storm and every still, quiet night, sending its faint gray thread into the sky for no one to see. And then I stop wondering. I pull my coat tighter and go inside, where the stove is warm and the lamp is lit and the familiar shapes of my own small life are waiting for me. And I sit down and I close my eyes and I listen to the quiet and I let the night be the night. That is all I have for tonight, friends. The fire is nearly out and the cold is coming in, and my old bones are telling me it is time to rest. Thank you for sitting with me a while. Thank you for listening. If you find yourself out walking on a cold night and you see something you cannot explain, do not be afraid of it. Do not chase it, and do not run from it. Just stand there and watch and let it be what it is. That is all any of us can do in the end. Good night. Now, sleep well. The night is quiet, and the town is safe, and the stars are keeping watch the way they always have. Close your eyes and let the dark come in soft, and let the cold wrap around you like a blanket made of nothing but stillness and time. I will be here when you come back. I am always here. Good night.